All right, so the dynamics of decision making during competitive goal pursuit. That's essentially what I've been looking at throughout my PhD, or in other words, about the last 5 years of my life. While I have spent a long time on this topic, you'd honestly be surprised how quickly all of this information evacuates your brain as soon as you submit. So I'm going to do my best to give you all a brief look into the research that I've done with Tim Ballard and Anthony L. here at UQ. So picture this, you're hanging out with friends, let's say playing Mario Kart, and you're pretty comfortable in your Mario Karting abilities, you're pretty good at it, having a great time. But then this one friend gets involved, and you know the guy, he's a bit of a macho winner, singles you out in front of everyone to challenge you, talks himself up probably too much, and something in your brain just locks onto this one thought: this guy has to lose. So you start doing intense finger warm-ups, you start running through every single possible shortcut in your brain, and you're gripping that really small controller too tightly, like uncomfortably tightly. And in this moment, your competitive drive has awakened. Now, I can't actually tell you how that story ends whatsoever, but for your sake, I do hope you win. So otherwise, your smug friend will not let you hear the end of it. But moving on from that fun little introduction to competition, what I can tell you about is competition in general and the work that I've done on that. So the best place to start would be competition itself, of course, what it is and what is involved. So we're all technically familiar with competition. We've competed in sports, games, and even in the workplace before. We've been in a situation where multiple people or groups of people are performing to achieve a desired outcome. However, this desired outcome cannot be achieved by all those involved. The end outcomes can be physical, financial, social, and are prevalent across many different scenarios. A gold medal at 100 meters hurdle, a cash bonus at work, recognition of becoming school captain. So there's a bunch of different types of rewards that you could be competing to achieve. So on a basic level, we all understand competition, but it's also been the focus of psychology research for over a century now, starting with Triplett's work on how ability increases in the presence of others, based on research with cyclists, from cyclists really. As the years went on, competition continued to be studied with varying conclusions. Some researchers found that it was beneficial to performance and improved how well you did, while others found that it was detrimental to performance, actually decreased how well you did. It sort of depended on certain aspects of the competition, a bunch of different nuanced ideas around that. So whether you're on your own or competing with a group, what the environment was like, what kind of goals were set, how competitive you are as an individual, a bunch of little things like that. The literature goes back and forth with these ideas a bit, culminating in meta-analyses that seem to propose two opposing effects of competition performance, where it increases and also decreases through other pathways, roughly cancelling each other out every now and again, honestly giving it a very, very unclear picture. But just looking at competition itself wasn't enough for us. We also wanted to look at things a bit more deeply than that. So a lot of competition research has been focused on the impacts of performance, outcomes, and other end results at the end of a competition. While this looks at these sort of beginning and end results overall, it's overlooking a lot of what's happening during the competitions. And as research went on, they did sort of shift their focus to include this sort of interim occurrence that's happening during the competition. And this is what we sort of wanted to focus in on, specifically using cognitive psychology. So that's where it comes into play for us in this research. So we looked at these interim factors that occur between competing and your end performance. Specifically, our experiment looked at evidence accumulation modeling and decision-making, specifically looking at the linear ballistic accumulator, or the LBA. And this LBA takes response time and accuracy data to give us measures of evidence strategy via model parameters, and we use these to compare evidence strategy across our variables. So just looking at how well did you do at the end, we want to see what was your effort like during this competition and what were your strategies while you were making decisions in the competition. Just introducing a few new variables also doesn't really help us out too much, just gives us a few extra data points to look at. So we'd still be losing a lot of information. Instead, we wanted to take a more dynamic approach to all of this data and see how things change over time. So we looked at competition dynamically, collecting data points throughout the entire experiment rather than just the endpoint. And this allowed us to see how effort strategy changed in response to things such as closing deadlines and planning performance, as well as these variables over time. This is the LBA itself. In simplest form, it involves accumulating evidence until a threshold is reached, at which point you make a decision. So you have a bunch of different numerals here, all representing a bunch of different things. The B at the top there is the threshold, which is what needs to be reached in order to make a decision. What it is reached by is the V parameters here, the drift rates. So you've got VT and VD in this case, just one of them is the correct decision, one's the incorrect decision. But it's using the target and distractor there. But yeah, you can see over time the increases, eventually it will reach that V threshold, at which point a decision is made, either the correct one or the incorrect one, depending on how you're willing to do the task, I suppose. Other values here we have A, which is the random starting point for evidence. So it's not always the exact same starting point for whether you think it's decision A or decision B. Does randomly vary a bit. And then we have T0 or tau, which is our non-decision time, just because you can't really take in information after it takes a couple of milliseconds to actually take the information in and start your decision-making process. So the two things that we want to get out of, or that we did get out of the LBA here, were parameters of effort and strategy. Effort is associated with drift rates of the V parameters, whereby if you try harder or pay more attention or process information more efficiently, you can gather evidence and reach a decision more quickly, so your rate of evidence accumulation would be greater. And then the other one is strategy, which is related to threshold. This decides whether you want to make quick and risky decisions by having a lower threshold that is easier to reach, or you make slower, more accurate decisions with a higher threshold. So what we've done is we've run 3 experiments focusing on competition types, dynamics, and rivalry. Those are the 3 different flavors of the experiment, I guess. In all these experiments, participants were presented with a cloud of randomly moving dots. That in reality, 10% of these dots were moving apparently either left or right. And it's up to participants to identify the direction of these dots and responding by either a key press and a keyboard. After each decision, they were shown a feedback screen for 1 second, and they gained a point for a correct decision or lost a point for an incorrect decision. And these points were used to compete against a computer-controlled opponent. In the first 2 experiments, participants were told that their opponent was a computer. In the third experiment, we tried the whole, this is a real person. Whether or not that went well, we'll get into that. But the computer opponent was always simulated using the LBA, so the same thing we're using for our modeling afterwards. And it was actually based on real data from pilot testing that we did. Took real data, had an idea about how people tend to perform on average in the task, and then through the model to make these decisions dynamically during the competition. Throughout the experiment, we collected data on speed, accuracy, performance, and fed through a cognitive model in order to get our desired parameters at the end. This is what the tasks look like. It's a lot of fun. Randomly moving dots with some of them moving coherently. We're going left in this case. That's it. Absolutely riveting stuff, undergrads and participants. I don't know you, but my idea for time is looking at this screen for an hour. All right. In terms of analyses, we fit the LBA to the data from each of our experiments through model fitting, which I don't know if you guys, many of you have done much cognitive modeling and all that, but it takes a really long time to run those models. It's really fun when it takes the maximum time that you've allotted, and it doesn't finish. So you go, all right, we need to make this run quicker, and we also need to run it a lot of time on the old computing cluster. Wouldn't have it any other way. Tim's great time. But yeah, so in order to make these statistical inferences from our data and from our modeling there, we then use Bayesian methods to find evidence in support or against the presence of effects between our variables and threshold drift rate. And then we looked at the effect. We also looked at effects of just raw accuracy and response time behavioral data, as well as all the extra analysis that come along with Bayesian modeling. So now I'll go over the 3 studies themselves and their results and what we did. So first, the experiment was all about types of competition. So a lot of studies in the past have looked at competition, whether any kind of competition is just blanket competition. Studies compared this performance against each other after a certain time frame, while others have asked participants to race against their opponents to achieve a goal for them. While these both sound like competition, and they absolutely are, they are setting up different types of uncertainty, which is what we focused in on to start the whole process, really. So we've got a couple of different types of competition that we are specifying out here. So we've got a tournament competition, which is where you have to have the best performance or score by the end of a known deadline. The goal that you need to reach is unknown because it's ever updating based on how well your opponent is performing. So think like a soccer match where you have 90 minutes, a known deadline to score more points than the opposing team. You don't know whether you need to have 1 point, 3 or 5 points or anything really, just because it's always going to depend on how well your opponent is doing. Against this, we have a race competition, which we have to reach a certain goal before your opponent does. The goal is known, however, the deadline this time is uncertain. It's based on how quickly your opponent reaches that goal that we know about. So this is like an actual foot race. We have to cross 100 meters before your opponents. You don't really know how long you have to reach the end first. It could be 15, 20, 30 seconds. This can depend on how quick your opponent is. Yeah. So both types of these competitions have been examined before, but they're both often classified as just competition. They don't really separate the two out. So when researchers look at the overall effects of competition, they could be ignoring the potential differences between these distinct types of competing. Not knowing how much time you have could lead to a different effect to not knowing how well you need to perform. We believe these there could be different effects here, different uncertainties, and that could be potentially one of the causes of the inconsistencies or opposing findings in the competition. So in order to address the issue of changing competition types, we directly compared them within the same experiment in the same experimental settings. So we directly compared these different competition types to each other to see their overall effects and their differences. So in this first study, we compared different types of competition to see how they impacted effort and strategy. We had tournaments where the goal was to have more points than your opponent by the end of the known time limit, and races where the goal was to reach a certain score for your opponent. We also had an individual condition where they had to reach a goal within a time limit, so a known goal and a known deadline. And there was no opponent in those conditions. There's also a do your best condition, or just hey, here's many points as you can in 20 seconds. That's what we use to compare all of our other conditions against. Participants completed 15 episodes of each of these competition types. So we found an impact of competition type on strategy, whereby tournaments made you respond less cautiously. So you made riskier decisions, and races increased your caution. The individual goal pursuit, no non-competitive condition, also had increased caution and also had a decreased effect on effort. We've got some very busy looking graphs here. So this is threshold. On this side here, we just have all of our conditions, and this side is these three conditions compared against the green do your best condition. So this case, we did have effects for threshold across all competition types, whereby tournament had lower thresholds than the do your best condition, and the race individual goal pursuit both had greater thresholds than the do your best condition. For drift rate, same thing going on here, but in this case, we only had evidence in support of an effect of individual goal pursuit, whereby you had decreased drift rate or decreased effort compared to do best. And the tournament and the race conditions had evidence in support of no effect. So we they're not considered significantly different. All right, moving on to study 2. This is all about dynamics of competition. So we also really wanted to know how effort and strategy change over time during a competition, as I mentioned before. But our first study had some roadblocks which prevented us from examining that within that experiment. So instead we just ran it again from the top and just focused on dynamics this time rather than different competition types. So we thought the behaviors and decision-making processes may change over time in response to changing scores and closing time limits. People might increase their effort in the closing moments of a competition, or perhaps they give up when their opponent's score is really, really far ahead of them. There's a lot of possibilities and a lot of ways that this can play out dynamically. Investigating this allows us to have more detailed understanding of competition and a more nuanced detail than just the overall data points at the end. So the second experiment here looked at just tournament competition, so just focused on one, but it allowed us to assess the dynamics within each competitive episode. We looked at relative score compared to your opponent, so how well your score is minus or plus your opponent's score to see the difference. And then as well as the time remaining in each competitive episode. We're going to see how these influence effort and strategy. We varied the starting scores between starting 7 points behind or 7 points ahead of your opponent, and also had 4 different deadline conditions. We needed to do this to reduce the correlations in the data, which is preventing us from looking at the dynamics in the first experiment. Overall, participants did all 52 combinations of those variables overall. So in this case, we found evidence in support of effects of score difference on effort and caution, whereby doing worse than your opponent, performing poorly was associated with less effort and also riskier decisions. For time remaining, results indicated that there was an effect whereby the more time remaining there was, the more cautious participants tended to be. In which case, it's like, I've got more time, I can make my decisions more slowly, nothing to worry about. So now we have different types of graphs, which are more fun to look at, but potentially also a bit more confusing to understand. Just focusing on the bottom two, honestly, threshold and drift rate, whereby the closer the scale gets to red, the higher the threshold and drift rate are. So the threshold, we see that the really, really risky decisions with the lower thresholds being made in time remaining is lower, as well as having poorer performance in the competition or the blue warning down. Threshold generally increases as time remaining and score difference both go higher, so the overall effects down on the side. Drift rate, low scores compared to opponents had lower effort. So down here we get close to blue. And while there seems to be some looking like an influence of time remaining, parameter recovery analysis indicated this parameter was not very reliable. And as such, even if we found like a base factor of 11 or so for that, but honestly treated as non-diagnostic, the recovery was not good enough to make any conclusions about that there. Then we have rivalry and competition. So the final study, the essentially idea that is linked to competition being rivalry. This is where you compete against the same person multiple times. You start to build this feeling of rivalry. Perhaps each competition becomes more salient, you feel more invested, and you really want to beat this other person in a friendly, competitive setting, of course. A lot of rivalry research tends to ask participants to imagine competing against a rival or remember a time where they competed against a rival in the past. But we wanted to maybe create and analyze the rivalry more experimentally instead. So there are a couple of different facts that go into rivalry, including things like perceived similarities between competitors. So if you think you're really similar to your opponent, you may have a stronger feeling of rivalry there, as well as being evenly matched in previous competitions. So as long as one person isn't always just outright winning all the time, that can help build a rivalry. For us, we just focused on repeated competition as the most straightforward to experimentally manipulate for our purposes there. So just competing against the same person multiple times or competing against different people. So that's what we had the people participants do. Go against the same opponent or different opponents for 30 competitive episodes. They were told they were competing against a real person this time around. We even had fake loading screens with created profiles to sell this. But honestly, I don't think distance really believed it. And we did a belief check at the very end of it. We didn't get super high scores. But they still have reports of people still being invested in the competition, but obviously not to the same extent as if it was real people in the real world setting. So we looked at how our effects of rivalry here changed over time. over multiple competitive episodes, this potential rivalry will develop. And we also measured how much distance they'll leave their opponents via rival after each competitive episode. So we found absolutely no impact to objective rivalry, or whether you pick up against the same person multiple times or different people. Just no effects to that really whatsoever. So being in the rivalry condition or the non-rivalry condition, no effects on the strategy there. But when we looked at perceived rivalry, after asking them, hey, how much do you consider this person to be a rival? Then we did start finding some effects there afterwards. So when we're looking at perceived rivalry, we found evidence of higher perceived rivalry being associated with lower effort and caution and lower caution. We also found that later episodes were associated with higher effort. So this is the objective rivalry condition results, where we have no impact of rivalry condition being the difference between grey and yellow here, but we do have that effect of time whereby effort is increasing as you go further on throughout your competitive episodes. The perceived rivalry score, we did find evidence of effects in this case, whereby higher perceived rivalry, which is in yellow there, this is showing lower thresholds and lower drift rates with the same effect of over time drift rate is increasing. It's possible here that maybe lower drift rates don't really make sense as less effort. Could be something more about less efficiency in processing information, whereby you've up against the person you consider a rival, and that can bring in a lot more emotions into your performance there, and things like choking during competition, possibly that. With the increase in drift rate there as well, it's also potentially people just getting better at the task and being more efficient or having an easier time figuring out which way the dots are going. So a factor in all this research has been the combination of social psychology topics being competition and rivalry, and cognitive psychology methodology being the modeling side of things. So by mixing these together, we're able to get a lot more out of what we're looking at in this research. So we've provided here potential reasons why there may be, as to why there may have been some inconsistencies in the findings about the effects of competition performance in the literature, highlighting the nature of the types of competition and other things as potential factors that are moderating the effects there. Applying the modeling that we've used to other research that's already been done in competition could elicit further findings beyond just the impacts of performance, specifically effort and strategy, as we have seen here, they're influenced separately by different factors. It's not always impacting those factors. So why is the research that I've done important? Honestly, because if it isn't, why have I spent all this time doing that? Please don't answer that question. No. Competition is all over the place, and it's likely not going anywhere anytime soon. So if it is sticking around, we should at least hope to figure out when it does and doesn't work. If we know when to implement competitions or what types to implement, we may be able to get more out of it and hopefully reduce the negative impacts it may have on people. In areas where caution could be preferred, we could look to implement race competitions that increase caution and avoid implementing tournaments, which would potentially decrease caution. If we know how people are likely to act when they are losing or running out of time in a competition, we could design interventions to best suit them in those situations. So to prepare them, we could help to prepare them to fight against that default response, where they would want to maybe reduce effort and instead give them some strategies to help them keep trying even in the face of that sort of adversity. And then if rivalries seem to be making people riskier and less efficient in processing information, maybe we should be looking to discourage them as best we can in a lot of different settings. And so aiming to instead mix up who people are competing against rather than having the same people, go head-to-head multiple times repetitively. Obviously, all of these ideas can't quite come to fruition with what we've done in this project alone, but it could be a starting point. Some future avenues that we could be pursuing, that could be pursued in this area in general, could be bringing more of the components of rivalry into one experiment to identify their individual impacts and strategy. So this would be bringing that perceived similarity variable into the mix, whereby you just have, hey, you're up against someone from the same universities, you're in the same groups, different universities. as well as the closest of their competitions, which can be done using false feedback and by telling them, oh, you've won this competition, you've won a lot of our competitions, so you've lost lunch, or you've lost some, won others. It's very, very close competition. And then just including that repeated competition variability in that represents the same person for different people. Modeling and competition could also be extended to more real world examples, such as sporting and organizational contexts, where the competitions are real and have real stakes. Individual motivation and investment in these competitions have some amount of an impact on how you would act in these competitions. And we honestly just weren't seeing that in our super fun tasks. So maybe it's the real world experiment stuff that could shine through a bit more there. As mentioned previously, the previous slide, finding ways to inject the modeling methodology into competition literature in general could do a lot for it. We could be looking back at findings and theories from the past and applying a new lens of cognitive psychology to that, which would give us a lot of mileage there as well. And then finally, one idea would be to introduce the affective side of competition. How does competing make you feel? What are the shapes of the competition? How does your rival impact your emotions? Finding a way to work this into the cognitive side of some of the things as well would also greatly widen the appeal of the research. And that is it. Thanks for listening. My post-PhD brain is now just shut down. No information left. Thanks, everyone.